Workers that work around exposed live electrical parts and lines must be qualified in the proper approach distances to the live parts and wires. This video will give some basic rules and procedures to help workers understand and be aware of the proper distance depending on voltage and the appropriate personal protective equipment required to work safe. All parts and lines 50 volts or greater to ground must be placed in an electrically safe condition by de-energizing it prior to a worker beginning work on the equipment. If it is not possible to de-energize the part or equipment, then prior to work, a written energized work permit and job safety task analysis is required. In addition, approach distances will be determined based on voltage prior to beginning any work. These approach distances are considered minimums as an effective means of preventing a shock or flash. A shock hazard analysis to determine the safe boundary distances, nominal voltage, and personal protective equipment necessary is to be performed prior to the beginning of any work. Shock boundaries are determined by the situation to which approaching personnel are exposed to live parts. It is also noted that flash protection boundaries may exceed the shock protection boundary. There are 3 shock hazard boundaries to be concerned with: the limited approach boundary, the restricted approach boundary, and the prohibited approach boundary. The limited approach boundary is the closest distance that an unqualified person can get to a live exposed part. The restricted approach boundary is the closest that a qualified person can get to a live exposed part. If a qualified person is to get inside the restricted approach boundary, then appropriate personal protective equipment must be used and a written plan of work must be approved. The qualified person can get inside the restricted approach boundary only to the extent necessary to perform work. The prohibited approach boundary is considered the same as actually touching the live part. Before going into the prohibited area, an additional risk assessment must be conducted. Each time the boundary is crossed, the appropriate flash flame protective equipment is required. A qualified person is not allowed to take a conductive object closer than the restricted approach boundary unless the following requirements are met. The qualified person is insulated and guarded, and the conductive part does not enter the prohibited area. The live part is insulated from the qualified person and from any conductive object at a different potential, and the qualified person from any other conductive object during live line bare hand work. Charts are available to determine the proper approach distances. Know how to read these charts and refer to them often. Unqualified persons are not permitted to enter spaces containing live parts unless the electrical conductors and equipment involved are in an electrically safe condition. Unqualified persons working close to the limited approach boundary must be advised of the electrical hazards and warned to stay outside the boundary. Unqualified persons can enter with the escort of a qualified person as long as they are advised of the electrical hazards. A flash hazard analysis to determine the safe personal protective equipment necessary is to be performed prior to the beginning of any work. The analysis shall be based on the worker's face and chest distance from the energized exposed parts. Flame retardant clothing and other personal protective equipment is to be used within the flash boundary. Electrical apparatus enclosures and other equipment shall have the arc flash hazards clearly identified on the enclosure or equipment. However, many times the identification stickers are worn or do not exist. It is then up to the qualified person to determine the appropriate protective equipment. Before performing any work, conduct a written hazard analysis of the area and the work you will perform. Refer to the proper charts to determine what level you will be working under and the appropriate equipment. Fill out appropriate work permits and other paperwork that is required prior to performing any work. Refer to the chart to make voltage and PPE determinations. For Level 1, the appropriate PPE are safety glasses, hard hat, fire retardant clothing, proper protective footwear, and leather or voltage-rated rubber gloves with leather protector. For Level 2, you must wear an arc-rated face shield in addition to Level 1 protection. Levels 3 and 4 requires complete body protection with the appropriate arc-rated flash suit. Level 4 requires 2 individuals to work together within the boundary. If the work involves lockout, tagout, the following procedures must be taken. First, identify the electrical equipment to be isolated. List the steps needed to isolate the equipment on the Lockout Tagout procedure form. After the Lockout Tagout procedure form is approved by the authorized employee and the responsible customer, follow the procedure outlined on the form. Lock out the equipment with an appropriate lock and tag the lockout with your name and contact information. Check for voltage with the approved detectors or meters. Ground each phase using an insulated hot stick. Prior to using grounds, check the inspection tags and visually inspect for bad wires or bad connections. Finally, when you're certain the equipment is totally isolated, locked out, and grounded, work can be performed. Only qualified persons should work on energized circuits. When a worker is exposed to uninsulated overhead lines, additional precautions must be taken to prevent accidental contact. Ideally, all lines that are energized should be de-energized and visibly grounded prior to beginning work. When a non-qualified worker is working near energized lines, the worker and the longest conductive object should not get closer than the limited approach boundary. For lines over 50 kilovolts, the limited approach boundary is 10 feet plus 4 inches for each additional 10 kilovolts. Vehicles have separate issues for their limited approach boundaries. These issues change because of the insulation of the vehicle, the type of vehicle, and the use of qualified persons in certain situations. For more detailed explanations of the limited approach boundaries for vehicles, please contact your supervisor. Never work from a vehicle without knowing the limited approach boundary. Workers that are on the ground should never touch a vehicle or equipment unless they have the correct personal protective equipment. If the vehicle is intentionally grounded, personnel should not touch the grounded vehicle. Proper barricades should be used to prevent personnel from getting too close to the grounded vehicle. Do not perform work in areas that are not illuminated sufficiently. Workers working around live parts should not wear jewelry such as rings, necklaces, watch bands, or other conductive materials. All tools and other conductive materials should be handled cautiously so that they cannot accidentally touch a live part. When working in confined spaces, other rules apply for exit and egress. Please contact your supervisor prior to entering a confined space. Be aware that your last line of defense is proper personal protective equipment. Prior to using any personal protective equipment, make sure it is in proper working order, fits properly, and inspected for wear. When working on or near energized equipment, the worker should use non-conductive hard hats, safety glasses, and/or face shields with proper arc flash ratings, fire and/or flash suit retardant clothing, voltage-rated rubber gloves with leather protectors, and proper protective footwear. Finally, warn workers of the dangers by using barricades, signs, tape, or individually telling them about the dangers. Working around electricity and being safe go hand in hand. Knowing the principles of and never crossing the limited approach boundary greatly enhances your chances of being safe and staying safe.